Well, hello and welcome back to the very latest episode of my Love Machine podcast. Now, today I'm going to be covering quite a sensitive topic. It's all about people that are in toxic relationships. I know many of my listeners are experiencing this at the moment, or maybe you've been through it at some point in your past, or maybe you've got a friend who's going through the same situation. So, today, to help me talk about this, I've got a wonderful guest. I've got the lovely Louise Erskine, who is a poet, a photographer, and a content creator. Louise, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm really, really pleased to have you because you've got quite a story, haven't you?
It's long and twisted, yes.
Long and twisted. That's the best kind of story, isn't it?
Yeah, no, definitely.
Wonderful. So before we start and you tell everyone what's happened in your life and what you've overcome, can you tell everyone exactly what you do? Because you're a poet and all sorts of different things, aren't you?
Yes, I do all of the things. It's sort of constantly evolving and different bits and bobs come up. I started after my youngest was born, I started getting offered like advertising jobs just on Instagram. And that evolved, my skills kind of developed, and that's evolved into me doing things for other people. I don't really work on Instagram anymore, but I'll still do marketing and photography and bits and bobs for other companies off of the gram, which is much less stressful. And yes, I write now. I used to write, and then I lost myself for a while there, and I came back to it in the last year or so. It's been really powerful for my healing to begin to write and to share my story and to connect with other people. So yeah, that's.
I've looked at your photographs on your personal Instagram page, and they're amazing. The way that you've done them, the lighting and I don't know if it's filters. I don't really know. It's not the sort of thing I normally look at because it's about you and your kids and things, isn't it? So I wouldn't normally be looking through those things on Instagram. But because we're talking, I had a little look on there, as you would imagine, and I was quite impressed. It's very colourful, and I can see a lot of imagination in that. So I imagine your poetry is probably the same. Now, you said that you lost yourself. So can we go a bit deeper? What happened to you?
Um, well, I mean, most recently, although when you look back, it's a very long kind of build, and I can see how I got there. But my last relationship, I was in an abusive marriage. And almost as soon, there were signs beforehand, but almost as soon as we were married, I was not allowed to maybe wear the things I used to wear. I wasn't allowed to like what I'd liked. There was just very little scope. I kind of got into a narrower and narrower version of myself, and I to the point where I just didn't even really know who I was anymore. All the things that I used to maybe define myself as didn't seem to fit anymore, or else they weren't allowed to fit anymore. And I got really, really lost. I didn't have any particular outlet creatively, or I wasn't really allowed to see my friends anymore, anything like that. So it was really very isolating and was confusing. And all of the things I'd thought about myself, I didn't know. I didn't even know who I was anymore by the end of it, to be honest.
So he was very controlling. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
Did
It
you
was a
see
lot of
any? Do you see any signs of this before you got married? How long were you together
okay.
before that?
Not very long, which is quite classic. These things generally go too far, too quick. That's quite standard. It's pretty normal to be manipulated. It's quite classic. Like I had been married before, which in hindsight was also an abusive relationship, but just in a very different way. I didn't connect the two things at all. I didn't connect any of it until I finally got out and was in counseling. But so, I'd gotten married the first time, and I'd have thought, well, this is it. This is me forever now. I'm going to have 2.4 children. I'm going to have a white picket fence. I'm going to have this life that I didn't have growing up, and I'm going to make it for myself. It's all I've ever wanted. And so then when that fell apart, I was in like just a really vulnerable place, and just fully ripe for the swoop in white knight kind of treatment that I got. And he just said all of the right things. And he didn't back any of them up, but I just wasn't really emotionally in the place to examine them particularly. And the promises keep getting more and they keep getting bigger. And all of a sudden, and I had always said right from the beginning, like, I never want to get married again. I don't want to be with somebody just because of a piece of paper makes it too hard for them to leave. Like, this is not the life that I want. And then all of a sudden, there I was pregnant, I was married. And I just, honestly, it went so quickly. I don't even really know how it happened. was scary. It's very scary how it all came about so quickly.
So for context, how long was it before you got married?
So we went on like a couple of dates in the March, and he was supposed to be going to stay with his parents were working abroad, out in Tanzania, and he was supposed to be going to stay with them. He said he wanted to travel, so he was going out, or none of it was true in the end. He just lost his job, he wasn't working. But his story was he wanted to travel the world, he wanted to stay with his parents. And I had recently inherited some money. My uncle had died, so I had some money. So in the end, he was in Tanzania and I went out. Then I think it was about the end of April. It was a couple of months later, even though we weren't ever really planning to see each other because he was moving and it would have been complicated. So I went to Tanzania. We went to Zanzibar for a couple of weeks, which were magical, which I paid for, as is normal. And
it's not normal. You mean normal for you in this situation?
Normal in a toxic relationship. Financial abuse is actually like another section. They're kind of starting to categorize it all on its own as like another kind of abuse. It comes a lot with coercion, but yeah, like being left in debt when you were otherwise in a very healthy position, stuff like that is very normal in an abusive relationship. So yes, there was that, and then by May, I think it was the end of May, we just kept talking a bit, like, and it was difficult because obviously we had like strong feelings, and I, it turns out, had like a codependent personality disorder, which was perfect for a narcissistic abuser. And so my dad was going for surgery and I needed to cover my dad at work, but I had a little boy from my first marriage. And he said to me, oh, like, I've really missed you and I want to make this work. I could come back to England and help you in time to help you with childcare. So because of the distance, he just moved straight in with me. So realistically, we'd had like 3 dates and 1 2-week holiday, and then we were living together. And then I got pregnant in the July. I didn't think I could get pregnant. I've had trouble historically. So it was kind of a shock. And then I lost that baby in the late September. It was June I got pregnant, and we lost that baby in the September. That was really emotional. So then straight away got pregnant again, and then we had a baby. So then while I was pregnant, he wanted to get married because I was pregnant, and he said like his parents were traditional, and then they were living in Tanzania still at that time. So they were going to be in England for 2 weeks, and he was like, well, we have to get married in these 2 weeks because my parents will be here, otherwise we can't do it till after the baby. And I wanted to not get married at all. But then I was like, well, if we're going to do it, I don't really want to get married pregnant. Like, I'd like to, like, look nice in my dress. And like, I was 8 months pregnant. I was a whale. And it all just, but, you keep kind of getting backed into a corner, but in a way that's really, it's not obvious like that. It's manipulative and it's very subtle. And I actually proposed to him. That's how manipulative he was. That's how good he was. I was like an out of body experience. And I was looking at myself like, what is happening right now? I still genuinely, it blows my mind that but there's a lot of, like subtle hints and comments and things that just kind of get under your skin and they play on your mind, and you kind of get pushed into these kind of choices. It's terrifyingly common. And it's just very subtle and very clever. And so, yes, we got married then in the July. So we had started dating in the March, moved in together in the May, and were married by July.
So that is quite quickly, isn't it? By conventional standards, it is.
Like, genuinely terrifying how quick that was. It didn't feel quick. It was just such a, like a whirlwind of a romance. And to be fair, like, that's one of the things I say to people now. It's a major red flag if somebody wants to move that quickly. There's a reason. And generally speaking, that reason is that they don't want you to see who they really are, which over time you will. It's a quickly gloss over it with all the shiny stuff until it's too late and you're trapped.
I see this a lot. It's very, very common now. People love bombs. I talk about this a lot on my podcast, and they end up with somebody who tells women can love bomb as well. It's a misconception, not just men. and they tell them that they're wonderful. They think that all their problems are solved. They're going to be with them to where they're going to be with them forever. Tell them wonderful things, and then really it fizzles out very quickly. Or they see the true version of them, because as you've experienced, you can't hide who you really are forever, can you? You
No.
can't. So you said that there were subtle clues here that went on. Can you give me some examples? Were they just little jibes? What sort of thing was it?
I mean, it's really hard to describe the coercive kind of control. I mean, things like I had, like 2 small children at home, or even when I was like pregnant and I had I still had a baby and I was pregnant. So maybe if I knew somebody in the village and I got coffee with them at like a kid's coffee morning so that the babies could roll around or whatever, then when I got home for maybe like 3 or 4 days afterwards, I would just hear comments all the time like, oh, you just want about having coffee with your friends, and I'm at work and I work so hard and I make all the money and you don't do anything and you're just lazy. And I'm like, I was looking after my baby. I was doing what was right for my baby. Whether or not someone else that I liked was there or not was irrelevant. But it got to the point, like where you just didn't go and do things because it wasn't worth having to be whined at about it for days afterwards. So you were never told, no, you can't go out and see your friends, but it was more having to deal with all of the consequences afterwards. And most of it wasn't true, but I let it, like I was still working for myself. I made the same amount of money that he did then. So it wasn't even true, but I would believe it because he was saying it. And I was, especially, like I just had another baby and I was pregnant again, and it all just felt, well, if he's saying it, it must be true.
Because you were vulnerable, weren't you? When you have a baby, you're vulnerable.
Yeah. I think I had so much vulnerability. I mean, I got into the whole relationship already broken down and vulnerable. So it was just kept piling on top of the other stuff that I hadn't, fully dealt with yet. So it just kept pushing me kind of further and further down this road. And I just didn't have the strength to fight it.
But do you think this would have happened had you not been hurt by the previous relationship?
I mean, theoretically, if I had understood myself better, I think it wouldn't have happened. But sometimes I think, sometimes it takes a little mess to clean up a big mess. And this was just the little mess that I needed to finally, I went to counseling for a long time afterwards. It was supposed to be couples counseling, but he made a big fuss. And like, the thing with like narcissistic abusers especially is that they're incredibly good at, they'll say something in company that sounds really either really innocent or actually really good to everybody else, but that is specifically designed to hurt you. And so we were in this it was the initial meeting with the counselor, and she was going to assign us somebody, from the program. And he did and I fully took the bait. And I was upset, and then he, used that, and he was like, I'm not getting counseling with you. You're crazy. You need to see your own counselor. So I did. And that turned out very badly for him because I finally understood the situation. And she kept asking me things about like our physical relationship, or, if I'd been hurt and all of that. And I used to think, why is she asking me this? Until like I sort of took some time out and we got back together for a little while. And then when he would do something, I would hear her questioning in my mind. And then I'd realize, oh, that's why she was asking me. Like, because when I was in the thick of it, I didn't even put together that I had been abused at all. And people say to me all the time, well, that's understandable when it was just emotional abuse. And I'm like, yeah, but it wasn't. I was raped. I was coerced. I was, there was a lot of like physical trauma. I had bruises. I just didn't understand why I had them. All of this, it's really genuinely shocking how much a person can do to you without you being able to put all the pieces together when you're in the thick of it.
For what reason? Because you were in denial?
I think part of it becomes like a habit. I remember very early on, literally probably the first week that we were living together, my dad was in the kitchen washing up at the sink, and we were sort of around the corner at the dining table, and I finished dinner, and I got up to go and put the kettle on, and he hadn't finished yet, and he didn't want me to get up. He sort of held my wrist and he ground it really hard into the table. And when I got away, my dad was like, what just happened? I was like, oh, nothing. And I was so, I think, humiliated and embarrassed that this had happened to me that I just swept it under the rug. And then that became a pattern. where I would just, not even that, like I would reason it away, or he's just heavy-handed, he doesn't mean to hurt me. And also 9 times out of 10, it would be, so like he would hold me, you know, in front of him, and he would dig his fingers into the back of my arms, but he would be saying how much he loved me and all of these, you know, like he wouldn't do it out of anger. He wasn't stupid. He was incredibly smart. So he would be saying all the wonderful things and all the reassurance that I needed when I questioned the relationship. But at the same time, he would be like digging his fingers into the pressure points on the back of my arms, and I was getting bruises, and I'd never bruised normally. So it was hard to get them because I have like a really high platelet count. So, and I didn't think, oh, he's hurting me on purpose. I genuinely, this was really quite close to the end. I was about to go to the doctors because I thought I had something wrong with my blood, and I genuinely just thought, I'm sick. I didn't think he's hurting me on purpose. That's how much control he had over me.
That is outrageous. So what was the purpose? He was trying to subliminally
it's
trick
part of like
you?
Love bombing. It's a control tactic. And love bombing, often it starts off with all the big gestures and all the wonderful things, and then there'll be something really bad that happens. I wrote a blog post on sexual trauma, and I remember saying at the end of it, like, I didn't stay for the man that hurt me. I stayed for the man that climbed into my bathtub fully clothed, boiling, you know, like afterwards crying his eyes out. That's the man I stayed for, not the man that hurt me like 4 or 5 minutes before that, and was the reason that I was now trying to literally boil my skin off till I could feel clean again. It's so constant. It's such a roller coaster. It's so up and down. And then that in itself, the way that activates the chemicals in your brain, like, and you're in this constant fight or flight kind of, you've got too much adrenaline all of the time. And that behaves like any addiction, whether it's, you know, alcohol or working out or drugs or whatever it is, that it behaves exactly like that. And then you need that. So when you leave, then you actually physically do go through withdrawals. And that's why so many of us keep going back so much.
Yeah. What did your family and friends think about him during this time? Were they aware of things?
As time wore on, but it was very difficult for them. I mean, to begin with, like, he was, and most people in this position are, that he was very charismatic. He was very charming. If anything, my dad found him a bit fake. But to be honest, he was the only one. Most people liked him. But as time wore on, I think it was more, they noticed changes in like my son becoming a bit withdrawn and more quiet, stuff like that. One time my stepmom said she saw him hurt him, and he kind of reasoned it away. And actually I left with him. We left, and then I came back. But, you know, there were just such tiny things. And there was always an excuse or a logic. You could always kind of reason it away. There were a few times, you know, like I had to have a word with me through books at my son a couple of times. And I like to say to him, like, you work in a school, you know, that isn't appropriate. You can't lose your temper like that with a child. Like, if you wouldn't do it at work, you don't do it at home. But he was so desperately sorry, and he was so sad. And he, you know, it seemed so genuine until the next time. And so they did start to notice things. I don't think they had any idea really quite how bad it was. And also the trouble was, because I was so controlled by him, like, if they said anything to me, I'd have just repeated. He would tell me all the time, well, they don't like me, they're trying to split us apart, they don't want this, they just want you not to be happy, all these kind of things. And so then it feeds into that narrative. If they had tried to say anything to me, that would just feed into what he was telling me anyway, and it just made it seem more like what he was saying was right.
So you chose to do what most people would do. You wanted to give him benefit of the doubt, didn't you?
Exactly. I mean, I just, honestly, do you know what? I think it was more, even in some ways, it was almost more about myself. Like, I grew up just with my mum, and I was very independent. If anything, I was a little bit gobby. Like, I was like, I'm tough. Like, you know, like most people just think, oh, it won't happen to me. That happens to other people. And I just thought, I'm so tough. Like, that couldn't happen to me because I'm not weak. Like, I'm not, you know, there's just no way. And so I think partially it just damaged the narrative. I couldn't allow myself to think of myself as being susceptible to that. And I just kept saying like, no, I'm tough, like nobody could do that to me. And it's this kind of battle then that you have in your mind between what you think of yourself and what you think is real and what's actually happening. And your whole view of reality just becomes so distorted over time that you just literally doubt everything.
That's how it works, isn't it? That's how they get you, really.
Absolutely. I mean, he had me convinced. He kept telling me that I was bipolar, and that was what our problems were, that I was crazy. So there was like all the levels of gaslighting, and I would lose my temper, like, and I would shout at him, and I would cry, and I would be so desperately hurt. I just thought, sure, maybe he's right. Like, and I went to see a lady that's friends with my stepmom, whose daughter was bipolar. So I thought, well, like, she sees me almost every day. She knows me really well. She's known me since I was sort of 13, and she's raised a bipolar child. And so I went to her and I talked it over with her, and she was like, absolutely not. There's nothing wrong with you. She was like, I know you're fine. That was sort of that was during the sort of end where things were beginning to unravel. And I would say to him, look, I've been and I've spoken to someone, like, there's nothing wrong with me psychologically, like I'm absolutely fine. But he was like, yeah, but they're not a doctor, they're not this, you know what, he used to tell me I was autistic as well all the time, because I'm not very sociable and I can be particular about, this is how he used to get me as well, like, I don't like ambiguity or struggle with, like if you say, oh, I like you, well, like, that could mean that like, I like my postman. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't mean that I'm into you. And I would just be like, I just need you to be specific. So he would deliberately try and mess me up by using words that meant something to me and something else to somebody else. And like stuff like that. And so he was always like, oh, it's just because you belong on the spectrum and you haven't been tested and you're like Asperger's and you're this. And maybe I am, but it wasn't anything to do with that if it was the case. And I'm coping just fine with life now that I'm not in that situation. I'm just not a social butterfly.
People aren't, though. Not everybody is. Well, what was the catalyst for you finally deciding to leave him? How did you get the strength? I'm sure many of my listeners would love to know that if they're in the same situation.
Honestly, I didn't leave over the abuse. I left over him drinking.
Right.
He started drinking all the time. Like every night he was studying, he was up late. He started off having a couple of drinks after work to unwind and then to sort of keep himself awake. And it just got heavier and heavier and heavier. And so the reason I didn't live with my dad when I was young is that he was a drinker. My mum's dad was an alcoholic. He had come back from the war with PTSD and there just wasn't any support then. So he was an absolute mess. And I was just like, I was so determined to not be that statistic, because children of alcoholics marry alcoholics. And I was like, no, I'm not raising my children in that environment. And so we got snowed in. It was February and we had a couple of snow days and it was like lunchtime and I was dealing with, so I had like a 5-month-old baby, a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they're all stuck in the house now for 2 days and they all want lunch and they all want something and they all want different things and there's this and this and it's mommy. And he just sat there and cracked a beer. It was like lunchtime. And I was like, no, like absolutely not. Why am I literally beside myself? And you're literally just sat there watching me struggle and drinking and just enjoying it like I'm selling tickets. And I just was like, I'm done. I cannot live like this. And he used to come home like that every day after work. And he would, we used to do these, like those HelloFresh meals. So I'd have a 2-year-old up on the island and she'd want to pick all the leaves off the herbs and she desperately wanted to cook it with me. But the baby wanted to be put down for the night. So I had him like fussing and he'd be stuffed up my jumper while I was trying to feed him, cook dinner with a 2-year-old. My other kids like, mommy, I'm hungry. It's late, and he'd come in and he'd look at the chaos and he'd just get the ump, put his bags on the floor and go to the pub instead of like helping. Like you could just take the baby and put him in his bed, or do something or take over dinner while I put him down. And he used to just be angry at me for the chaos instead of helping. And in hindsight, that is not love. But yeah.
Was he a deeply unhappy man?
I don't know. I think one of the hardest things with this kind of thing is, like when somebody isn't a particularly good human, but you understand why. So I can look at his childhood and it wasn't unhappy or anything, but it was a little odd and go, I can see how at this time in your life, this is the reason why you didn't develop that connection in your brain, which has led to you being having a narcissistic personality disorder. And I can see that and I can get that. But there comes a point where as an adult, you have to own that and you have to do something about it. You can't just, like, I can see that and I understood it. And so for a while, I kept just trying to be enough. And obviously, like, I didn't feel like I was worth anything, which fed very well into the situation. But yeah, there just kind of came a point where I was like, I cannot spend the rest of my life being punished because you aren't willing to get the help that you need. So I honestly I wouldn't say unhappy, because that's almost like that seems like a sadness to me, more like kind of entitled, like unhappy with life insofar as that he didn't have enough money, he didn't have enough status, he didn't have any of these things, but instead of earning them, he would just be angry that he didn't have them. It was kind of like, it was more like an entitled attitude to a lot of life. I mean, I found this really horrifying email on the computer a few months after he left, where he'd basically written a letter to Ed Sheeran trying to manipulate him into giving us a house. Like, how
what? Sorry, hang on. He'd written to Ed Sheeran. Okay,
literally.
Sorry. Can you explain a bit more?
And then he was saying, like, his kids were ginger and it was so funny and all of these things we had in common, but you're the same age as me and you've got all of this and blah blah blah, and you could just buy us a house and it wouldn't even be and I just remember reading it and being like, I don't understand. I'm like the complete opposite of that, whereby I don't even play the lottery, because if I had all of that money, I'd be like, I didn't earn this. Like, I'm fully too far probably the other way. And I was just so horrified. Like, I did not know I don't know where it even comes into a person's mind that that's appropriate behavior. I printed it out. I was so shocked. I like saved it. It's in my evidence box.
Did you send it to him?
It was an email, so I assume so.
Did he reply to you? One of Ed Sheeran's team?
Not that I'm aware of. I think he's probably too smart for that.
Yeah, that's outrageous.
It was unbelievable. Bizarre. Like, you couldn't make that up. It was so ridiculous. Like, if it happened in a movie, you'd be like, oh, they went a bit far there. Like,
yeah, I recently watched Ed Sheeran in a movie, funnily enough. it was about the Beatles, but that's another story.
Oh, yesterday.
Yes.
My son loved that movie.
Yeah, but that's filmed in Galston. I've got family there, funnily enough, around that area. That's why I watched it. And I don't know if Ed Sheeran's from there, but it implies that he's from there. Anyway, enough about Ed Sheeran. It's not really relevant to your toxic relationship, because I'm sure Ed Sheeran's a lovely guy.
I'm sure he's got it all.
Let's not connect him to this. I'm sure he's got it perfect. Whatever his song is. So,
that is perfect, isn't it?
It is. I got that in there. So just a name drop now. But I have to pay him royalties now. Anyway, so you made this decision. You had enough of his drinking, enough of this terrible behaviour and abusive relationship. Did you tell him directly that was it? Did you lock him out of the house? What did you do?
I was very dramatic. Unfortunately, we were snowed in, so I still had to be there in the house for another couple of days. I was very dramatic. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't. I wrote down the time and the date on a piece of paper and I slammed it on the table in front of him. I went, I'm calling it. And he was like, what? I don't get it. I was like, time of death. And I put the piece of paper in front of him. I was like, I've had enough. I'm out. And then he found somewhere else to live. But then we were supposedly kept trying for like a year after that. And he was supposed to do, I'd said to you about the counseling, and I carried on. I did mine every week for about 6 months. I think he went to 2 sessions with his, and then we had an argument and he was like, I'm not seeing the counsellor anymore. Like, it was all very engineered in hindsight. But I mean, we kept sort of trying back and forth. I said to you, we got back together for a little while, but at that time, then I could kind of see what my counsellor had been, why she'd been asking me some of the questions she had. And it was the first time where it was at Christmas Day, and it was kind of like a toddler meltdown, like, and I'd said something was his fault, and it was just a really tiny thing. And like, anybody else would just go, look, yeah, I'm sorry, I miscommunicated that with them or whatever. But he just was beside himself. I mean, and he was screaming and crying, and he threw himself down on the bed, and his arms and legs were flailing. It was literally like when you're a toddler, like you tell them there's no Haribo in Tesco's and they go like full on apocalyptic. Yeah. And it was like that. And it was the first time that I knowingly, like, consciously pandered to him just to minimize this. Normally I would just be devastated that I'd created this, and it was the first time. Then I just was like, right, I just need to manage this situation until I can get my kids out of here. And then after that, he texted me, it was about a week later, and he was studying, and I think it was New Year's Day. And he sent me a message, and he was like, oh, at 3:00, I'm going to stop studying and have a drink. Either I'll be drinking to celebrate that I've got a decent wife, or I'll be drinking to celebrate that I'm single. And I was like, well, if your behavior is exactly the same, whether you've got a family or not, like that says enough for me. It was like 10:00 in the morning, and there was no possible, I'm going to quit studying at 3:00. Do you want me to take the kids to the park for an hour before I start drinking? Nothing even like that. And it was 10:00 in the morning, and I texted him back, and I was just like, oh, you might as well take that drink now, honey. Like, and that was me. That was the last of me. I was like fully all the way out then, but that was almost a year later. That was like New Year's Day, and I had initially left the previous February.
Right. Do you still have contact with him now? Because you've got children, haven't you?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I learned to grey rock eventually, which was very key in that situation. I'll tell you what, though, I didn't realize how much it still affected me. He called me the other week, like all my kids have just had their birthdays. And he called me about, it was before Lucas's birthday, about just popping by. My son was from my previous marriage, but I'd gotten him, like when he sees them, he has to see them all together. They're like a package deal. He's not allowed to see one of them. And I don't like him to see them actually if his girlfriend's not there, which is a weird, most people would think you wouldn't like the girlfriend, but she's actually the only reason that I am comfortable with them being there. So she's actually really wonderful, and I do worry about her, but there's nothing I can do about that. But he called me, like on the phone, and normally it's just, I stick to like WhatsApping, and I just short to the point answers and very careful. But he phoned me, and he was like, he spoke to me like he would just, a stranger. Like he was so charming and so lovely. And I literally put the phone down, and I was sat in the dark out loud by myself, and I just said everything about that gave me the creeps. And then I didn't think anything else of it until I went to bed that night, and twice as I was falling asleep, I did that thing, like when you're a kid and you dream that you're falling and your whole body kind of jolts. And that happened to me twice when I was falling asleep. And that was the first time in nearly 4 years. And I realized that I hadn't done it since I'd left him, whereas I used to do that, falling asleep every single night. And I hadn't even noticed this whole time. Like there's still constantly things. There's so much that your memory, you kind of black out to cope with the trauma, and it's coming back, but slowly.
It's adrenaline, isn't it? That's the reason.
Exactly. It's that fight or flight. Then you're always constantly producing too much adrenaline.
Mm-hmm. So what's happened to you since this point? Have you able to date again, find someone else, or are you still learning to do that?
I've mostly done a lot of inner work on me, because I got to the point where I was like, well, actually, I realized that my marriage before was very different, but also abusive. And I could pinpoint to my first narcissistic boyfriend being when I was about 16. So this is obviously like a pattern that I've gotten caught in, and I've got a broken picker. So I've done a lot of work on me and just understanding my own kind of self-worth and making sure I'm in a position to actually not make the same mistake all over again, because the way it was escalating, if I ended up there again, I probably wouldn't get out alive the next time. That's just statistically the most likely thing. So I've been very careful. I went on a couple of dates before the pandemic. There was no spark. We ended up being friends. That was nice. But I don't know if there's no spark because of, because of my trauma, and I'm just not ready for there to be a spark, or if it was, I don't know yet. And I think I probably would have had we not had a pandemic. I think for the last sort of year or so, I think I've felt like I might be able to go for a cup of coffee or something, but I haven't left the house. So That's tricky. I did join Bumble for about a week, which was so completely overwhelming. Like there were just so many, every time I swiped on somebody, it would say, like, oh, you've missed a potential match. And I was like, why? I can't find one person I want to have coffee with. Why is so many people swiping? And I didn't find it flattering that so many people wanted to talk to me. I just kind of thought, well, they're clearly not very picky. they're just swiping on like everybody to see what they catch.
That's what men do. Men will swipe on 90% of people. That's what happens.
Which is crazy.
It's because there's so many more men on there. That's the reason why.
Well,
so they have to do that, and they don't really engage. So there's better ways. I would say to you, maybe try a meetup group or a social event, if that's possible, rather than doing something like a dating app.
You know, I'm like really old school. I feel like I just want to be in some musty old bookshop and look across and catch someone's eye. But you have to leave the house and enter a musty bookshop for that to happen. So it's not very 2021, is it? It's a bit early 90s.
It is, but I'm old school as well. I think do what you can at your own pace and take things the way you want to. But the pandemic,
naturally, I'll meet somebody eventually. It's not like I don't talk to people anymore. It was difficult because having been isolated from people, I did have some like social anxiety, and also I find that I really examine everybody's actions now. If they want to go out with me, or if they say they want to do something for me or whatever, then I really analyze it, and I'm very, very cautious now. Also, I've kind of just gotten married a lot, so I don't know how good I am at just, you know, like I feel like it's going to be weird to just go for coffee and then be like, no, I don't want to do this again. I don't know if I have what it takes to just be like, no. But we'll find out. I'm excited to find out. I've learned a lot, certainly.
Yeah, I think just take things the way you want to take them and do things that you want to, but don't let some idiots in your past stop you meeting someone amazing, because I'm sure there's someone out there that would treat you the way you deserve to be treated.
Somewhere. I do believe that there is.
If you don't leave the house, they're not going to find you.
Well, that is an issue.
So go do something about it, and I'm sure you'll be absolutely fine. But do things when you want to. But don't hold this pain any longer. You've worked on yourself, and allow someone else the chance to meet you. That's what I would say on that. That's my rounding up little summary for you.
I will do my best.
Wonderful. Well, it's been great to chat with you. I'm sure my listeners have heard lots of useful information and really enjoyed your story, as traumatic as it is, because people do have these sort of experiences themselves. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you so much for listening. I'd love to give you a free copy of my latest book, which you can download right now from my website, jamespreece.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, I'd really appreciate it if you could share the love by taking a few seconds to write a positive review on the iTunes store right now. See you next time.